Welcome to this episode of Moments in Leadership. My guest today is Rear Admiral James R. McNeal, United States Navy Reserve retired. Rear Admiral McNeal is a 1986 Naval Academy graduate and a career logistics and supply corps officer whose leadership spans carrier strike groups, special operations, expeditionary logistics, and global sustainment. He holds a master's degree in organizational management and is joint qualified at level 2 with extensive experience across both the active and the reserve components. Now, his sea duty includes assignments aboard the USS Constellation and the USS Merrill. Ashore, he served as a supply officer for SEAL Team 1 and later transitioned into the reserve component, where he held multiple command and senior leadership roles. Those included Commodore of the 5th Naval Expeditionary Logistics Regiment, commanding officer of Navy Cargo Handling Battalion 5, and commanding officer of the Naval Supply System Command Logistics and Operations Center. Now, before we get into today's conversation, I want to pause for a moment and thank the Supercast supporters who make this project possible. Their financial support helps offset costs of producing Moments in Leadership, and it allows me to keep the show completely free of product commercials. And that support is also helping me elevate this podcast from an audio format now into video, obviously. This episode is actually the first full video interview I'll be publishing, and I'm excited about where this is heading, and I appreciate your patience as I continue to learn, experiment, and improve on the quality of the video series over time. I still intend to provide outtakes from the interview for exclusive viewing by my Supercast subscribers. Now, today, I want to specifically thank a few people: Jonathan Brown, John Stallone, Kyle Addis, and Mark Nicholas for recently joining as Supercast supporters. I deeply appreciate your support and your belief in what this project is trying to do. Now, if you enjoy the show and you want to support it, you can do it through the Supercast link in this account's profile, or really any of my social media accounts like LinkedIn, Instagram. It's all on there. Okay, now back to Admiral McNeal. He was mobilized multiple times in support of Operation Noble Eagle, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. He commanded Navy Expeditionary Logistics Support Group Forward, and he led Defense Contingency Support Team Kuwait, and then later served as Deputy Director of the Central Command Deployment and Distribution Operations Center. His final assignment was as the commander of NAVSUP or NAVSUP Global Logistics Support, where he led a worldwide network of fleet logistics centers providing integrated logistics and contract support to the Navy and the joint forces across every warfare domain. Rear Admiral James McNeal's current role at the U.S. Naval Academy is as an adjunct leadership professor and sprint football coach at Annapolis, Maryland. In this episode, we talk about leadership from the logistics side of the house, how decisions are made far from the front lines and how they shape outcomes on them, and what it means to lead quietly, consistently, and under pressure. He was also super gracious in openly discussing some of the very recent leadership changes that have taken place at the Naval Academy. And I found this particularly refreshing, as it's always difficult to get comments on why anyone in a leadership position is ever relieved or fired. Admiral McNeal brings a perspective shaped by decades of enabling others to succeed, often without recognition, but always with accountability. So with that, welcome, retired Rear Admiral Jim McNeal, to the podcast. Now, Professor McNeal at the U.S. Naval Academy, teaching leadership, which is why I think this episode is going to be so fascinating. And we have we have a few friends in common that we've discovered with Bill Mers and Ron Boxall, who have both been guests on the podcast before, and they're some of my favorite episodes. And if, as listeners are listening to this, have not heard those episodes, definitely go back and listen to them, because I think they're fascinating. And we were talking offline, sir, that that I'm fascinated by leadership in the submarine community. But everybody just heard your bio. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, or tell a little joke about yourself, or just start with your origin story.
Well, the thing about having long bios is if you hang around long enough, you have an impressive sounding career. But it was an honor and a pleasure to serve for as long as I did. One of the things I tell midshipmen is some say, hey, I'm going to do 5 and dive. That's what they say. Do my 5 years and get out. And other kids will say, oh, I'm going to do a career. And I tell them, you have no idea what you're going to do until you get out there.
Right.
And I took, kind of every step of the way. I just took it as it came. And I think if I decided to stay on active duty, I wouldn't have been as successful. I really enjoyed the reserve piece of it. I know you've talked to some reserve. I know you're a reservist as well, and you've talked to some reserves on your show. And I've always really enjoyed those because that's kind of the world that I'm familiar in. And twice a citizen, right?
Yeah.
Twice a citizen. The people that do the reserve world, and really, and I don't know how the Marine reserves or the Navy reserves. You can just leave anytime you want. So it is a truly an all volunteer force. I've seen people go to lunch and not come back.
Yeah. And I tell people that in the reserves all the time. So I'll tell this to listeners. I'm very proud of my reserve service. I had 2 tries at reserve service. The first try at reserve service was when I first got off of active duty, and within 2 years I was out of there. I hated it. And then I got out of the reserves, and then after 9/11 came back in the reserves and flourished in it. It was just, I just don't think I was ready to go from active duty to the reserves. But I'll tell listeners, reservists feel like this. We understand that you make fun of us. We get it. We make fun of you too. That's okay. But at the end of the day, I'm telling you, the reserve units that I worked in could go toe to toe with any active duty unit with a 30-day workup. The reserves are truly a force multiplier out there. And if you're on active duty and thinking about getting out, what the Admiral just said is true. If you enlisted for an 8-year contract, 4 active and 4 IRR, you are, this is my terminology, non-obligated. You are not obligated to show up for the next drill weekend. You can just walk out the door. So you're an at-will employee. It's almost like being a civilian. So if you stop having fun doing it, just turn in your papers and walk. If you do that too many times, you'll get a bad reputation. But I think that's what you're saying is the reserves are, it's got to be fun. Otherwise people wouldn't come back the next drill weekend.
Well, and you talked about your kind of two sides of your reserve service, and mine was really 9/11, post 9/11, and pre 9/11. And pre 9/11, and I went in the reserves just, I mean, for the money. I was going into sales, straight commission sales. So the money wasn't a lot, but it was money. But I had been in I went to the prep school, as you said in my bio, and I just couldn't imagine not being in the Navy. I didn't hate the Navy. I love the Navy. I just didn't want the Navy to be my career. And so I did. Went into the reserves in 92, and then 9/11 happened, and everything just changed overnight. And I was going into, I put on 05, August 1st. I was selected for 05 command as an 05 August 30th. And I had my last drill weekend of my previous unit on September 9th. And then 2 days later, 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden I'm getting phone calls and emails, and I'm not even in the seat yet. And so that was, you talk about fake it till you make it.
Right.
The next month I'm standing in front of 250 cargo handlers in Tacoma, Washington, who are hitting me with all these questions about when are we going to deploy, when are we going to get in the fight, and all this sort of thing. So for me, it was a very, very stark difference. Pre 9/11, the biggest decision we had to make was where we were going to go to lunch that day.
Mm-hmm.
After 9/11, I've deployed twice as an 06. I have friends who deployed multiple times. It is a force multiplier, and it is one of the great blessings of my life that I was in the reserves, because I met so many wonderful people and so many patriots. I had a E6 that worked for me, my first 06 command, and she was in Norfolk. And I always say the reserve, the dogs sniffing each other's butts in the reserves is what's your civilian job, right? That's the first question you ask, right?
Yeah. What do you do in the real world?
What do you do in the real world, right? And she was the CEO of a company in Norfolk, and she was an E6 in the Navy. And I said, okay, explain. And she said, when 9/11 happened, I was just barely under the age cutoff, and I enlisted because I just wanted to serve. And that to me is the reserves.
Yeah.
That to me is the reserves. And the other thing I'll say about the reserves, because we don't want this to be all about reserves, but one of the best kind of backhanded compliments that I got the first time I deployed to the desert, to Camp Arif John in Kuwait, was someone told me, "Wow, you're a reservist? You're good."
Yeah, yeah, I've gotten that too, and it surprises everybody,
It
and
does.
we will get off the reserve thing because we're gonna have to talk about Ron Boxell here in a second, but and then we're gonna talk about you, but the
My favorite subject.
yeah, the the interesting thing about the reserves for me was that it was truly being a citizen, and I'm using my air quotes for people who are listening to the audio version, a citizen soldier. Because I would show up to a drill weekend and everybody had their uniform on and everybody had their rank and everybody had their MOS. But there was also the, yeah, but he is this in the real world. So I almost had two, when I was a battery commander, I had two batteries that I was commanding at the same time. One was the battery of MOS trained Marines, and the other one was the battery of the real world Marines. And so even though one of my Marines may have been an 0811 gun crewman, could have been an incredibly qualified EMT on the outside. So now I have a second corpsman, or I have a Marine who's a welder in the real world, or a diesel engine mechanic, or a generator mechanic, and they may not have been MOS qualified, but there were times when we kind of needed to fix some stuff, and maybe they weren't MOS qualified, but somehow that stuff got fixed on the fly. That's really valuable.
Absolutely. It's like I said, it was perfect for me, and I loved every minute of it.
That's great. We found out that you have a relationship with Ron Boxell and that you all deployed together. For people who have listened to his episode, they know that there was an incident where he threw another fellow officer against a wall locker. I'm wondering if there's any chance that was you.
No, and I don't. So when I listened to the podcast and Ron was talking about that incident, I was a locker officer and we only had 3 of them. And so I texted Ron after I heard it and I said, "Hey, I just heard your podcast, and was that me you threw up against the wall? If it was, I don't remember that." He goes, no, it wasn't you. It wasn't you. And he named who it was. And I said, that sounds like something that he would do for sure.
Right,
But,
right.
Ron, when I got to the ship, Ron was already there. I had come from the Constellation to the Merrill, and, it did not take long before, it was very obvious to see that Ron was just stellar and was going places. One of the stories that didn't make it on the podcast, and I don't want to talk out of school, but we were up in Washington, and he was CDO, and I had duty also. And Greenpeace tried to attach themselves to our ship, and we had to deal with all that stuff. But Ron was just always great with his guys. The CEO loved him. The CEO did not love me, so it was I was the inverse Ron Boxall. But I had when he continued to do well in the Navy, I was not surprised at all, and he's a great friend and a great American.
Yeah, I get out on the golf course with him. Well, we didn't get out this year, but generally once a year we get out together. I've enjoyed getting to know him and calling him a friend now. He was a great episode, and anybody listening that hasn't heard that one, if you want to hear a good story about 2 officers going at it, you listen to that episode and you'll get a good dose of it. But we're here to talk about you, and I'll just start off by going back in your bio. Graduated from the academy in 1986. Tell me about your origin story, coming into the military, coming into the Navy. What were some of your early lessons that you learned? I generally don't ask people this question about what they learned when they were training to become an officer, their midshipman years, but I feel like yours is probably pretty fascinating. I'd like to hear a little bit about that and any great leadership lessons learned you had going through the Naval Academy system.
Yeah. So 86 grad. My dad's class of 62 from the Naval Academy, also a Marine artillery officer, Vietnam vet. And he, I guess I'd say it politely, he kind of challenged me based on some of my personal behavior to be better if I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. And for those that want to hear, I'm going to do a little plug for my first book, The Herndon Climb. The story's in there. I don't want to get into it here, but he was very, very tough, as a Marine father is, but he was absolutely right. If I wanted to succeed at the Naval Academy, I needed to be better. And so when I got to the Naval Academy, I think I was definitely prepared for it. The thing that was disappointing to me was the lack of support for people that struggled back in the 80s. The term now would be kind of mental health. I wouldn't say it was a mental health thing, but it was everybody has to find their own path. And the Academy, any sort of crucible event, the Academy, has academics, you have the physical mission, you have to live under, a very strict honor and conduct system. And as young people, we, can run afoul of those. And the Academy back then didn't have a lot of support if you were not successful. And so I guess the answer to your question was, what I really learned leadership wise at the Naval Academy was how it felt not to be led properly. And I've never forgotten that. And I know I don't want to fast forward to the end, but so what I'm doing now with the mentoring that I do with the midshipmen is probably, if I was laying on the psychiatrist's couch, it would probably come out of overcompensating by meeting with the midshipmen that I meet to provide for them what I wasn't afforded the opportunity. And I also did that as a commissioned officer as well. What I tell these midshipmen is, our job is not to lead the good people. Our job is to lead the people that are struggling. The good people don't need us. It's the people that are struggling that need us. That's that 20%, that 15% that struggle. That's the whole reason we exist. And I've always focused on those folks and made sure that they got the attention that they deserve, because I think it's really easy just to focus on your people that are doing really well. It takes a lot of time and effort and care to focus on the folks that aren't doing well. But I think you'd agree, Dave, that's our job as officers.
I think it is. I think, do you suspect that is a function of just people as human beings want to take the path of least resistance, so you can feel like you're doing a great job as a leader if you're just focusing on the ones that are good, because you can be proud of yourself by saying, look, I've mentored these very successful people, and there's really no, grading, if you will, grading, on the back end as leaders that evaluates you on the basis of how many people were not successful in your command or anything that you're leading. And I wonder if that's kind of a byproduct of just human nature. What do you think?
It is absolutely human nature. And I think that when you have somebody that's struggling, it takes a lot of time and effort. Well, I know it takes a lot of time and effort to really dig in. And I also think, and I don't want to be cynical about this, but I think a lot of folks just don't care that much. Because if you're going to mentor and help someone who's struggling, that means that you care about them. And I just don't know how much, especially in our modern society, how much we care about other people. Because I see it in coaching, I see it, in mentoring. Oh, can you believe that person did this? I'll have midshipmen come to me. Oh, I got to tell you about this plebe, and they did this and they did that. And I'll ask them a question. So where are they from? I don't know. How many brothers and sisters do they have? I don't know. What's their family situation? I don't know. So you're going to impugn this person, and you have absolutely no idea what their personal backstory is at all. So they may have come from foster homes. They may not even have a stable family. They may come from an abusive family, and you don't, and you're judging them based upon their performance as a midshipman. This may be the first time they've had 3 hots and a cot, where they haven't had to worry about where they were going to sleep that night. You have no idea, do you? Oh, that's a good point, sir.
Yeah.
So I don't think that I don't think that let me not say that. I don't be so cynical. I think that it takes a lot of effort, and you have to care about people in order to help people. But I will be very definitive about this point. You cannot be a successful leader unless you love people. And I don't mean physical love that gets you, thrown in jail. I'm talking about agape love. I'm talking about loving people, wanting what's best for them, and having that be your sole attention. I want my people to all be the best people they can be. And if you don't love people enough to get to know them and care about them and be able to put that plan into action to help them, then you can't be a successful leader, in my opinion. And some people will fake it for a little while, but they'll always come to a certain point where they have that inflection point, and they'll fail, and everybody will say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe this person wasn't successful." Well, because they weren't doing it right from the beginning. That's what I say.
Yeah, I wonder if the inverse of that also applies, going back to what we were just talking about, which is, as a leader, you've got to be working on your most challenging people in your command. Or said differently, being a leader isn't about leading the 90% of the people. It's about leading that 10% that we always seem to have of people who are not meeting a standard. And I wonder if that emotion plays into, and I'll just make up an example. Let's say I'm a leader and I have these 10% of people, and I don't feel like they love me because they're making my life difficult and they're dragging the rest of the 90% down. So does the inverse of that apply, where you say, like, okay, because I don't feel loved by them, I am not going to apply my energy and leadership mentoring to them, and they get abandoned, and probably compounding the problem of that 10%.
I agree 100%. I think that absolutely happens. And one of the things that I kind of joke about, so in case somebody in power hears this, I joke about, but there is a percentage of people at the Naval Academy who feel that this would be a great place to work and a much better place to work if there just weren't any midshipmen here.
Exactly. Right. That's like, right. My command would be fantastic if it wasn't for all the sailors and Marines I had to deal with. Right. Exactly.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting because I just had a flashback. Now I just had 2 flashbacks. I'll tell you about both of them. One is that one of the best things about this project for me personally, one of the things that I get out of this, in addition to meeting all these fascinating people I probably would have never met had I just carried on with my life, is that I have the ability to reflect back on and be introspective. Is that the right word? I think it is. Of my career and what I did and how I acted as a leader. And there isn't a single episode where I meet somebody new where I don't say to myself, God, if I could go back and do it all over again. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the purpose of this project, is to give everybody the opportunity to do it all over again before they do it in the first place. That's my first reflection. But also, going back, you just reminded me that I think one of the most important components of my early career was that I came into the Marine Corps. I was commissioned in 1990, and Desert Storm had not started yet, and the Marine Corps didn't wear name tags on their uniforms yet. We just had the regular camis. There was no U.S. Marines over one pocket and your name over the other. That didn't exist. And so as a brand new platoon commander, I had to learn every single person's name by face. And that's daunting when you walk in.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and you walk in and you've got 50, 60, 70 people in a platoon in artillery. I had a big platoon because I had a headquarters platoon as my first platoon. That's a big platoon in an artillery battery, and I had to learn every single person's name by face. So obviously the rank was easy because they were wearing it, but their last name, and it forced me to get to know every single person. And I could probably rattle off all their names right now and probably only rattle off 10% of the rest of the Marines I ever served with in my life by name. But yeah, I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
not advocating for taking the name
Well,
tapes off, but that was a benefit of it.
and I mean, what is the saying that there's nothing sweeter to someone than hearing their name? And I've always used first names, whether I've been, with my junior officers, midshipmen, or players. It always just bugs me when someone uses a last name for somebody, because it always strikes me as you just don't care enough to even ask them what their first name is, and it just and I think back, you're absolutely, you think back to your time as as an officer, and I think back to the senior people when I was in 02, 03, and I had, you interact with somebody who's senior and they called you by their first name, hey Jim or whatever, and you just, I mean, just, it was an unbelievable feeling that an 06 would know my name.
Right.
It's so powerful. It's so powerful. And yet we have leaders that are, lazy, too lazy to even find out what the first name of this person is.
Yeah. I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about the early part of your career. I'd love to hear a couple good sea stories about some of the leaders you came across when you were a young ensign, JG, lieutenant timeframe on active duty out at sea. Do you have any good leadership stories? Either leaders above you, leaders below you, leaders that were successful, leaders that were failures. I always love hearing about people's leaders early on in their career, because I feel like those are the people that really shape the rest of your career.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. How much time do we have? Right. So my first command was USS Constellation, and I got on the ship on March 20th of 1987. That's the day I reported. On April 1st, I took over as the dispersing officer, which is in charge of all the money. And I had about $500,000 in my safes in my office. That's a lot of money, 500,000. And then on April 2nd, a bunch of Brinks armored cars showed up on the pier, and we unloaded $8.5 million. And so when we deployed on April 11th, 9 days later, I had $9 million in cash in my safe.
Wow.
As a 23-year-old brand new ensign. So not only did I have this huge job, I had a division of 30. And again, we deployed 3 weeks after I got there. And so a lot of this was catch up. I was very fortunate. A plug for our senior enlisted leaders. I think, I think it's kind of rote to say, oh, you have to listen to your chief or listen to your gunny. But I can't emphasize that enough. I had a senior chief that worked for me that was just fantastic, and he was so helpful. And I guess I would say, as a little leadership tidbit, you have to let them be helpful, right? And it's a very, 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 kind of sweet spot in the middle between being too reliant on them and then not listening to them. And there's that very, very middle ground where you want to, it's like a baby that's starting to walk, right? Hey, I don't need your help. Well, yes, I do, because I'm falling, right? And it's the same thing with an ensign. So very fortunate with that. But a couple of leadership situations there, we may talk about this later, but I remember sitting at a sailor of the quarter board, and there was an E5, and I won't say his name, and he was very attentive to me. What do you need, sir? How can I help you? Obsequious, probably. But as a young ensign, I'm just kind of eating this up, right? And so we went to the sailor of the quarter board, and there were some other supply officers on it, and there was a CW03. His name was Danny Sharp. And I said, hey, how about this DK2? And he said, have you ever watched how he treats his peers and those below him? And I said, no, not really. He said, he's terrible to them. And I said, again, I'm an ensign. Hey, he's great to me. And Danny said, well, of course he's going to be great to you. You're his boss. Watch how he interacts with his peers and especially the people below him. And I was a little taken aback, and, I was pretty emotional back in those days, and I kind of got pissed off a little bit, but I kind of held my tongue and I paid attention, and he was absolutely right. Is he did not treat people well. He treated me well because I was his boss. And I heard a saying later that describes that type of person. I think we all know those types of people. It's called a monkey in a tree. Have you heard that, Dave?
No, I've heard the term spotlight ranger, but that came from my Army friends.
Okay. So monkey in a tree is, if you're above the monkey in the tree, all you do look down is you see a smile.
Okay.
And if you're below the monkey,
yeah.
Okay.
Right.
And that's how this guy was. And the lesson that I learned from that, and I'm glad I learned from it early, was you're going to have people that work for you that are, and this guy was very, very technically competent too. So you're going to have people that work really, really well. They're going to work hard. You're going to like them, and they're going to make your life easier. But if they don't treat people well, if they're a toxic leader, you have to help them figure out what you have to help them get out of that toxic leadership. And if they can't, then you can't continue to promote them along, because that is not something we want to promote. And it's very, very difficult to do that, because you're kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face type thing, because now you've made your life way harder.
Right.
And I don't know if we'll get, potentially get into, some high profile incidents and things of people that aren't successful at the highest level. And I think when that happens, people tend to say, oh my gosh, how did fill in the blank? How did this happen? I would argue they've been doing this their entire career. It just caught up to them way too late. And again, if you deal with somebody as an ensign, that's way better than having it happen to them as a captain and they get publicly humiliated.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to
So
get into that.
That's one really, that's one important leadership lesson. The other one was, so the way that it was, the supply department on a carrier, it's obviously huge. We had well over 600 people in the supply department, twice as many total crew as were on the Merrill. And so we had a bunch of divisions, and they were divided up into our readiness and our services division. And services was dispersing, which is what I was, the enlisted galley, which was a massive job, the ship store, which was huge, because the ship stores, all the vending machines, the laundry, the barber shop, so a huge job. And then the wardroom, which was the private mess officer. So you had, if anybody's been on a carrier, you have your normal wardroom, you have your dirty shirt, which is right below the flight deck. The chiefs had a mess. The flag officer on board had a mess. The captain had a mess. Plus, you had all the staterooms. You had all the spaces. So, just massive jobs on a big ship. So, one of the advantages of going to a big ship is that you get to do different things. If you go to a small ship, you do the same job your entire time. So one of the things that they do is you rotate around to different jobs. Well, the job that the dispersing officer goes to is typically the sales officer. And the sales officer was a friend of mine. He was a prior enlisted corpsman, had gotten out of the Navy, gotten out of active duty, had stayed in the reserves, and had become a chief corpsman in the reserves, and then had gotten his degree, came back on active duty, couldn't get into the medical service corps to be a lab officer, which is what he wanted to do. So he ended up being supply. So he was a JG, but he was he was certainly more experienced. So the plan was for me to rotate into that job, for him to go to the wardroom, which is typically a warrant or an LDO because it's so massive, and then our wardroom officer to go to the enlisted galley. And the guy that was our boss presented that plan to the supply officer. And, one of the truisms that in every service is everybody at one rank, their number one goal is to get to the next rank, right? Every 04 wants to be an 05. Every 05 wants to be an 06. And this supply officer that we had, he was no different. He had been selected to be a carrier supply officer, which is an automatic 06 ticket, as long as you don't get in trouble. And so when the plan was presented to him, he nixed the plan because he didn't want to take the guy out of the ship store and put me in there because I think in some past life he had some problems or something. Anyway, long story short of it was I got put into a job that I had no business going into. And the whole reason I was put into it was because the supply officer was more worried about his career than my career. And I didn't know it at the time, but and I learned a lot in that job that I was ultimately not successful in. But what I came out of that whole experience was, it's, as a leader, it's not about your career. It's about everybody else's career. And if you empower everybody else to be successful, it's impossible for you not to be successful. It's not you're successful and everyone else is successful. You make everyone else successful, and then you'll be successful.
Yeah, interesting. I always feel like mistakes are some of life's best teachers. And, you just mentioned that you were in a job that ultimately you weren't successful in. What's one of your mistakes that's really stuck with you in your career, and how is it handled by your chain of command?
Well, in this particular instance, I was very stubborn. I went into a job that I was not really qualified to be in. And I won't spare the details of the intimate supply things that happened. But anyway, I did a very, very poor job of relieving. So that was on me. But what I should have done, and I just had this conversation with my wife a couple of weeks ago about another subject, but she brought up the constellation. I didn't ask for help, because why would I ask for help? Because if you ask for help, that's a sign of weakness. That's a sign you can't do it on your own. That's a sign you don't know what you're doing. And I'm trying to compete with my peers. And so, yeah, why would I ask for help? That's what lousy people do. And what I realized later, and what I've done since, is the stronger you are, the more you ask for help. Knowing if you need help, and knowing where you have weaknesses, and knowing where you need assistance and asking for it, that's the ultimate sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness not to ask for help. And I was, my time there would have been so much different. It was a ton of pressure on me, ton of pressure on my guys. My guys did not have a good experience. I'm sure I was just running around with a chicken with my head cut off. So it wasn't pleasant for anybody. And one of the big reasons for that is because I wouldn't ask for help, because I was too proud. And that is the biggest lesson I learned about, personally, that I took forward. And I always ask for help. Hey, if there's a better way to do it? When I coach football, which is, a passion of mine, I'll ask my players, hey, what do you think we should do here? What do you guys like? It's not about my idea. It's about what's the best idea. What's the best way to do something? So asking for help is absolutely critical. Now, if you're asking for help on the same thing 20 times, we probably have a different thing to discuss.
Right.
But if you need help, ask for it.
Enjoying Moments in Leadership? Help the project get more guests and reach more listeners by leaving a 5-star rating and a quick review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It takes like 5, maybe 10 seconds to do the reviews. And it really helps me to continue bringing on inspiring stories from senior military leaders. Additionally, when guests see that it's popular or hear about it in their commands, it helps me get them on as guests. If you're able to chip in a little bit to help with the project, please head over to my Supercast support page at mill.supercast.com or through the link in the show notes, because every little bit helps. Now back to the episode. Yeah, I learned that very early on in my career as well. I also think that that leadership in the supply community, and there's probably other ones too, but we're going to talk about this one. It's interesting because one of my thesis on leadership in the military is that it's very hard to score how well you're doing as a leader. I'm thinking mostly in the Marines, but this is in the Navy too. Less so in the Navy because you're probably driving a ship or operating some sort of piece of equipment, and you can be evaluated on that. But leadership at its raw level is very difficult to say your job as a leader was successful, but only because we think so. In the supply community, I got to imagine that you can kind of quantify things. There is inventory, there is ordering systems, there is procurement, there is the money. I mean, you can measure those things in the supply community in a way that if you're an infantry platoon commander, it's really tough to measure how well you did on a field exercise, because on a field exercise, it's blanks and simulation and assumptions, and it's kind of hard to evaluate. In the supply community, I imagine that your ability to be measured on your success is definitive.
Well, it is, but it's a bit of a blessing and a curse, because you have lots of inspections. There's certain inventory validity is a big one. There how successful you are in how much money do you donate to the the ship store donates the profits back to the MWR. How often do you turn over your stock? When someone needs a part, do you have it, or is it something that you should have that you don't have? So there's a lot of very tangible things that can be judged and inspected and that sort of thing. But that's not necessary. I would argue that's not necessarily the measure of how successful you are, because ultimately in the supply world, it's what type of customer service are you providing, and that can be somewhat intangible. But the other piece of the pie is, hey, what are you doing with what you have?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, I've seen folks who have maybe would be described as B operations that without their hard work and leadership would have been D operations. And I've also seen folks that have all the resources, personnel, money, and they don't do anything with it. So when I was in a leadership role, when I looked at, hey, how is this unit doing, and what are those measurables that we can look at, I just didn't look at that and say, okay, well, that's the measure of the situation. What's going on? What's their manning right now? Well, they're only 80% manned. Wow, and they still got to 92%. That's pretty impressive. How about the other one? Well, they're at 98%. Well, what's their manning? Oh, they're 100% manned. Okay. Well, I think the previous example is better leadership. So I don't disagree with you, but I also don't think it's as cut and dried as some would say.
Yeah, interesting. You and I were having a conversation before we started recording about how hard it is to manage time and say no to things. But I think at some point, every leader eventually has to put their foot down and say no to something. We're not doing that. Sometimes, oftentimes, it comes at a time where, you can think it through. And sometimes it comes at a point where you don't have time to think it through. And I'm wondering if you can share a moment from your career where you had to say, hey, we're not doing that. And what was that moment like, and what did you take away from it?
So I had kind of a unique situation the first time I deployed. I was the ordered in as the CEO of the Defense Contingency Support Team in Kuwait, based out of Camp Arif John. We worked for the CENTCOM J4, or actually, excuse me, we worked for DLA. The other unit that was next to us was the CDDOC, the CENTCOM Deployment Distribution Ops Center, and they worked for the CENTCOM J4. And on my way into the theater, I checked my email in Leipzig, Germany, at the MWR there, and they told me that halfway through my tour, I was going to become the deputy director of the CDDOC, and I was quite upset about it, and got on the phone with my boss and complained, and finally he just told me to shut up and do my job. And he was a GS-15 and I was an 06, and he was right. I didn't like hearing it at the time. So I paid attention to what was going on at the CDDOC because I knew that I would have to go over and be the deputy director there halfway through my tour. And what I observed was there was the deputy that I was going to relieve was an 06, and the director was an Army general. And what I observed that they did is they never saw a crisis or an emergency that they didn't love or that they didn't create. And they constantly were looking for that next thing to do that would cause a lot of effort and churn in the unit. I remember this person came over to me and said, "Hey, did you see that scroll on, we're watching CNN. Did you see that scroll about something happening somewhere? And, we're going to try to get ahead of this thing." And I said, "Have you been tasked with this?" "Well, no, we're just going to try to get ahead of it. And it's a big deal." I'm like, there's no reason, and she said, "Well, we don't have a lot going on right now." And I said, "That's fine. We've been working at a hard pace. We don't need to create a situation just to churn and burn our people. Let's give them a little bit of downtime." And she didn't really like that answer very much. And so when I came over and took over as the deputy, I had an all hands meeting with everybody. And the main point that I made to my troops were, look, we're not going to be out there trying to find missions that have not been assigned to us. We're not going to operate as if everything's an emergency, because if everything's an emergency, nothing else is. And we're going to be good team players, but being a good team player means that you do your job, not everybody else's job. And a Master Chief came up to me afterwards and said that was the message that this team needed to hear, because they were kind of on the brink of collapse. So as far as saying no, sometimes we like to be everything to everybody. And if we're try to be everything to everybody, we're nothing to everyone. And I think type A folks like you and I and others listening to this like to say yes to everything. But if you say yes to everything, you're going to end up diluting the power, because you only have a certain amount of bandwidth with all your people. And so saying no as a leader, and I'm not very good at it, frankly, especially with my personal time, but saying no as a leader is absolutely critical, or you're going to absolutely bleed your people out.
Yeah, or bleed yourself out, or your family, or all, probably. Yeah, and that's true in the civilian world just as much as it is in the military as a leader. That's my punctuation of your statement. Thanks for sharing that. I have a question for you. You can answer it from your time in the fleet. You can answer it from your time in your current role teaching leadership at the Naval Academy, or you can tell two stories to answer it if you want to. But I'm wondering if there's a story from your career that really highlights moral courage, because I don't think we talk enough about that in leadership circles And that could apply to relieving people that need to be relieved. It can be applied to standing up for something that you think is wrong, especially in the face of somebody senior to you. And if you have any highlights from your career on that topic that you think others could learn from, I'd love to have you share one or even two stories if you have them that could be from either side of your experience.
Let's start with the low light. And you mentioned relieving somebody. So in my last position, I was an Echelon 3 commander, recalled reservist. So my last 40 months, I did that. And I had 8 of the fleet logistics centers that reported to me, all supply corps active duty 06s. And one of the things that, anytime any commander, every 90 days after you take command, and then every year after that, you have to do your DOC survey. And I think that's pretty standard across all the services. And you had to brief it to your boss. And so occasionally on the schedule, we would have the DOC survey if we had a change of commander was after a year. And so we had a DOC survey scheduled for at the end of the week, and it was with one of the fleet logistics centers. And for those that don't know, I think it's defense. I think it's Defense Equal Opportunity Climate Survey.
Okay.
So maybe it's only Navy. Maybe it is only Navy. Anyway, it's interesting how they do it. It's kind of a, my command values X. Strongly agree, neutral, and they put it on a Likert scale. So they assign a numerical value to it. And then that numerical value goes into this massive database with all the previous DOCs. And then because you say, oh, well, this factor is a 3.7. Well, what does that mean? It's a meaningless number. But what they do is they tie it to what they call the Navy average. And so you want to be at the Navy average for these various command climate traits. And if you're above it, and it's not right at it, it's maybe plus or minus 5% or something. But if you're above it, you're green. If you're in the middle, you're neutral. But then if you're below it, you're red. And obviously you don't want any red. And I think the first one that I did when I got in there, or after I'd been in there a year, I had like 2 or 3 green and no red. So that was fantastic. But anyway, so I had a civilian, he was a retired Supply Corps Reserve captain, Pat Jordan. And Pat came up to me and said, hey boss, we're doing this DOCS debrief on Friday, and pretty standard stuff. And he said, yeah, this one's just a little bit weird. He said, yeah, usually I get it. I usually request it 72 hours in advance, and I haven't gotten it. It's tomorrow, and that's a little strange. And they said they'll get it to me, and they're having some issues or whatever. And I said, okay. So that kind of was a data point. So we have the DOCS, and it's bleeding red. And so now I'm kind of like, okay, well, that's why we didn't have it 72 hours in advance. And the CO starts off his presentation to me, and I had an SCS vice commander and others in the room, CMC, of course. And he said, I'm very proud of the fact that we had a 95% DOCS participation rate. That was his lead. That was the lead of the article. And then he proceeds to make excuses for the poor command climate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we got done. It was very unsatisfying. There was no accountability taken. There was no ownership taken. There were no means of fixing it. It was just kind of it is what it is type of situation. And I will say, I wouldn't say an ensign right out of Supply Corps school has great gut feelings, but at that stage of my career and that stage of my life now, my gut's pretty right on.
Mm-hmm.
And my gut feeling was, I need to relieve this guy. And so I talked to my chief of staff, who had not had '06 command, but it had '05 command, and he was geo-batching anyway. So he was living in San Diego, and his family wasn't there. And I said, I may need you to go do this. And I thought about it, and the moral courage piece is, I decided not to do it because this was in the wake of the Fat Leonard stuff that had put a black eye on the supply corps. And I felt like my lack of moral courage led me down the road of, well, this will just make things worse. This will be another black eye for the supply corps because we're going to relieve a Navy captain, et cetera, which should have had absolutely nothing to do with that decision. And so I ultimately chose not to do it. And then come to find out, so the people and ultimately who was affected were the people that worked in this bad situation. And we tried all sorts of things. We tried all sorts of different things. We sent people over there. We did this and this and this and Band-Aids. And so his people kind of continued to suffer. And when he left, because it had been good before he got there, when he left, it went right back to where it was, being good. And so obviously the system worked exactly like it's supposed to. And I did not have the guts, call it moral courage in an academic setting. I'd say I just didn't have the guts or the testicular fortitude to make that difficult decision, because I was worried about the reputation of the supply corps. And what I found out later was this person who I was protecting was not worth protecting. He had some previous issues, and I got a firsthand account from someone who had worked for him, who told me several years later how bad of a boss he was in his previous 2 positions previous to that job. And so, as we kind of talked about before, this was a person who had demonstrated certain things throughout their entire career, and no one ever stopped it from happening. And here I was, kind of the last gasp of doing it, and I didn't have the guts to do it. And you talk about going back and doing it differently. I don't necessarily agree with that line of thought, because the person I am now is based on the millions of mistakes I made. But if I could do one specific decision differently, I would do that decision differently. And it kind of haunts me to this day, because I feel so bad for those people at this command who had to put up with that, because I didn't have the guts to step up and do what I was supposed to do as a commander, as someone who was in charge of that unit. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed that I didn't pull the trigger on that.
I'd love to stay on this topic for a while. I'm going to share a quick story with you in order to set the context for us to stay on this topic, because I think it's important. And I don't think it's something that we talk about very much in early on leadership classes. And if you're talking about it at the Naval Academy and I'm wrong about that, let me know. But I'll share a very quick story. I've never shared this story before on any of the podcast episodes, but when I was a very young lieutenant, I was, and I told earlier, I was in a headquarters platoon commander, lots of people. And my very first platoon sergeant, who was so instrumental in helping me develop as a leader, his name was Ed Garrison. I've talked about him on other episodes, and we're still friends to this day. He got promoted or moved on to some other billet at the battalion and was taken out of the battery. And I got a new platoon sergeant that came in that was a fire direction chief. And he came in and he checked in his alphas, and he had a stack of ribbons on that included a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. And I asked him where he had served, and he answered, I think he said Beirut, something. It was something in the 80s kind of thing that happened, maybe Panama. It was one of those Grenada, one of those small kind of things. He was not a Vietnam vet. And great, he takes over the platoon, and he starts leading in a way that I was not used to, because I had only had one platoon sergeant with garrison at first. And then now I'm seeing somebody do something differently, and it just wasn't sitting well with me. And this is back before computers and everything else. And you had people's record jackets. We called them service record books for the enlisted side, and OQRs, officer qualification record books for officers. It was just a folder, and you read the stuff in it. And I started to go through, because I wanted to understand where he was coming from before and what other billets he had, because I didn't feel like he had a really strong handle on the platoon. Nor did he have a strong handle on the fire direction center. And I started going through his record jacket, and I get to his awards section. He didn't have any of those awards that he checked in wearing.
Oh my gosh.
Unbelievable. And I'm like a second lieutenant. So I have just sat through TBS, where you talk about all these ethics classes and leadership classes and, what now lieutenant kind of scenarios. And in an academic environment, all of those answers are pretty straightforward. Well, I would relieve that person. I would fire him. I would, something like that. So now I find out that this guy showed up in his. So what does dumb Lieutenant Armstrong do? Well, he does what he thinks is the smart thing to do. And I hold a formation and I fire him as my platoon sergeant. I just walk out to my platoon and I say publicly. I mean, well, to the platoon, I just said, hey, so I took the next scene. This is just like they tell you to do in combat, right? Like the next man up. I said, hey, Staff Sergeant B, I won't say his last name, Staff Sergeant B, you're relieved as a platoon sergeant. Please fall out and go see the battery gunny and find out what your new assignment's going to be. Sergeant so-and-so, you're now the platoon sergeant. I need you to take charge and carry on with the plan of the day. And that was it. And so the platoon sergeant went in and told the battery gunny and the first sergeant that I had just fired him. And next thing you know, my battery commander erupts, calls me into his office. He's like, what do you think? I was like, well, sorry. He lied. He showed up with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. Like he lied to you and me and everybody else. Like I relieved him. Like I thought I was supposed to do. And I got my ass chewed so bad for relieving, because I didn't have. Now, in hindsight, I understand that I didn't have the authority, but in my head, through all of my leadership training, like I thought that's what you did. You held people accountable and you relieved them and you fired them, and it was next man up, just like if you were in combat and somebody got shot in the head. And so I had this imprinting moment that was, don't ever hold somebody accountable like that. Now, in hindsight, I did it incorrectly, right? That's the takeaway here. I did it incorrectly. So I was in the wrong. Yes. But that was a very early on. And I'll tell you, I feel like that experience, and this is why the reason I'm telling the story is because I want to use it as some context to lead into our next part of this discussion, which is I think there is an institutional bias against firing people. I think it's very, very difficult. I had a friend of mine, this may or may not be true, but a friend of mine said, like, if an infantry battalion commander gets relieved, or let's just say a destroyer ship CO gets relieved, it's not done by the 06. That goes all the way up the chain of command, probably to the Commandant of the Marine Corps or, CNO or somebody. Something like that is going all the way to the top. And I just think to myself, like, gosh, that's got to go above the 06 level. I mean, really? You got a guy who is going to get relieved as a battalion commander or a ship CO, and that's got to go. That's got to pass all of the muster all the way up to serious flag officer level. I guess the answer is yes. And then when it does happen, you get the standard loss of trust and confidence. And so nobody learns anything from that relief. Now, the rumor mills start, and it was, if the guy runs a ship aground, I think that's kind of, right? That's an easy one. Yeah. But if it's anything else, if it's like a moral issue, an ethical issue, a drinking issue, anything, no one ever learns about this. And I just wonder if we're missing something there. And I'm asking this question in the context of, or in the environment of, just yesterday, the date today is the 25th of November. And just yesterday, the I don't know the term for the leadership position, but a Navy captain at the academy was just relieved. And I saw on the news and I read, and it was, guess what it was for? Loss of trust and confidence. So I just wonder if we're missing something when it comes to people learning about how to be better leaders, because when the bad leaders are actually held accountable, no one ever learns from that or finds out what the deal was.
No, it's a good point, and if I could answer it through the course of a time that I think I did show some moral courage, I'd like to kind of circle back to that if I
Sure.
can.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we had the unit, the command that I became my last command. I was the deputy commander for about 8 months, and a couple months before I took over, there was an incident with another one of these Fleet Logistics Center COs, and there was a, a, a Liberty incident. And I don't want to get into the specifics, but there was something that happened, and my boss investigated it, and his boss, who was just soon to become my boss, was not happy at all with the results of the investigation and the decision by my boss to basically not do anything about it. And so one of the things that they did, Admiral Greener did when he was the CNO, is he put together, because there were a rash of Navy COs, and some of, like, kind of a little bit to your point, Dave, they were, some of this was the CO saying, well, gee, I didn't know that, you couldn't do that, or, the people didn't really know what command meant. And so they put together this document called the Charge of Command. And it was a 2 or 3 page document that you had to read. And it talked about all the things a commanding officer is supposed to do. And so the day that you would take command, you had you signed it, and your boss signed it. And there was always a little photo op. If you Google me and, Admiral McNeal charge of command, you'll see some pictures of me out there. So when I had my charge of, and it's usually a one-on-one meeting. So this is kind of, hey, look, you're getting ready to take this job, and here's my instructions for you. Well, my boss said, hey, remember that incident with so-and-so? Yes, sir. Yeah, I wasn't happy with how that got resolved, so I want you to take another look at that. So we did the chain of command and everything. And so I went into my general counsel, who's GS-15, and not my personal attorney, but the command's attorney, but also a prior JAG. So, if I crossed boundaries, he would tell me, but he's a good friend, and he always gave me great counsel. So I went into him and I said, hey, this just happened. And so isn't this double jeopardy? And he said, no, it's not double jeopardy. There was no UCMJ thing. It was just investigation. And I said, well, if I find something, I mean, how do I relieve this guy? It wasn't even on my watch. And he said, I'll never forget it. He said, all you have to say is loss of confidence in ability to command. That's all you got to say. And I said, okay. And he goes, and remember, you can be fired for the same reason.
Yeah. That's a great response.
Which was
yeah.
great counsel.
Yeah,
It was
it
great
is.
counsel. So it is a blanket catch-all to give commanders the leeway to handle situations, because ultimately, if you're a commanding officer and you have another commanding officer working for you, they can't be effective if you don't have confidence in their ability to command. I mean, that's really what it boils down to.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular situation, I just happened to be heading up to where this person was for a previous reserve trip that I had planned. And so I had my game plan, and I was going to meet the guy for the first time. And I was going to say, hey, is he going to bring it up to me? Am I going to bring it up to him? And really I was prepared to relieve him if it didn't go the way I thought it should go. And so we were meeting and doing a tour of a facility. There was an Air Force guy, Air Force 3-star, 2-star visiting, and that's why I was up there. Anyway, at one point he said, "Hey, sir, can I talk to you?" Pulled me aside. "Hey, did you hear about this incident?" And he explained it, and he took full, he was contrite, took full admission, just handled it. He couldn't have handled it any better. And so right then and there, I said, I'm gonna keep him in command. And the next day, I got back, and my boss called me, and he said, "Hey, did you dig into this?" "Yes, sir." "What'd you decide to do?" "Sir, I'm not going to relieve him." He said, "I'm not happy with that decision." I said, "Sir, it is my decision, is it not?" He goes, "Well, technically, yes." I said, "Sir, I'm not going to relieve him." And the phone, and he hung up the phone. So I was definitely proud of myself for that one, because I did it for the right reasons. And I think when you're looking at those types of really, really, really difficult decisions, those get made poorly when you allow extraneous and external things to come into it. Because as difficult as a decision is, I've found sometimes the most difficult decisions are the simplest decisions.
Yeah.
It's just the ramifications and consequences of making the decision.
Right.
But to your other point of, hey, should we be publicizing this stuff? Absolutely, yes. And I will tell you what they do at the Naval Academy. At the Naval Academy, they do what they call midshipman XYZ stories. And so with honor and conduct cases, they will say midshipman X went out on liberty with midshipman Y. Both were underage. Midshipman Y got so drunk they had to be dragged, blah, 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 blah. And then they tried to cover, so they'll go through the whole case study. They won't use names. And this stuff is taught as a way to, to give, without keeping privacy concerns, of course, but giving, the midshipman case studies and, hey, don't do this. So should the Navy do something like that? I think it would be valuable. The how you would actually do that in practice, I'm not quite sure. I've had with the situation yesterday, lots of rumors floating around about that. I'm not sure we'll ever hear what the exact reason was, because I just don't know how that would come out. I mean, I suppose a FOIA request at some point, but those are sometimes months and years down the road. But
Sure. And there's the
I
rumor
think
mill that will
the
come
big,
out.
yeah, the rumor mill for sure. But I mean, I think the bigger issue, we talked about it a little bit, if and I don't want to talk about the case specifically because I don't know what happened, but if an 06 does something that requires them to be relieved, or does some things, plural, that is not an isolated incident. That is not something that just started to happen. This has been a pattern throughout their entire life, probably. And no one, much like the E5 back when I was an ensign on the Constellation, no one ever pulled this person aside and said, "Hey, what you're doing right now is not good. It's not appropriate. You shouldn't be doing that." And even though the person obviously made Navy captain, so did a fantastic job, at some point someone should have pulled them aside and said, "Look, whatever you're doing, you got to stop that."
Yeah.
Now, maybe they did try to do it. I don't know. But if they kept doing it, someone decided to kick the can down the road instead of and I think if your Navy career is over at 7 years, that's far less painful than having it splashed across every news outlet in the country.
Yeah.
As an 06.
I wonder if some of this is a function of the retirement system, which is going to sound like a weird thing to say, but let me tell you what I'm thinking there. If I have if I'm a commander and I have a direct report in the military that has 16 years in, and I don't feel like they're doing a good job, they probably haven't been doing a good job their entire career. The problem has been passed on and passed on and passed on to somebody else because the path of least resistance is to just make them somebody else's problem. Now, all of a sudden, you've got that problem at the 16-year mark, and somebody looks at you and says, if you write them an adverse evaluation, you're killing their career, and they only have 4 years left until they can retire and get their retirement pay. Just write them a mediocre evaluation and send them on their way. And let's just say that a leader decides to do that, write a mediocre evaluation. Now, all of a sudden, the chain of command, because that evaluation is going to be seen by others up the chain of command, say, why did you write such a velvet knife report on this person? This is reading between the lines. This is a terrible fitness report. This is a terrible evaluation. And now all of a sudden your leadership gets, where's your documentation on this? Why? And then you get the pressure to then reinflate the fitness report or the evaluation to something that can pass muster with your boss's boss. And this whole cycle just perpetuates. I don't know how that gets fixed. I'm curious if at the very foundational level of developing leaders at the Naval Academy, if things like this are being talked about, or is this problem just going to keep brewing?
Great question. So the midshipmen do what they call MDR, Midshipman Development Report, and they do one kind of halfway through the semester and then at the end. And this is how they get their aptitude grade. And their aptitude grade is really important. Yeah, I think it's 1 through 10 get an A, 11 through 20 get a B, and it's basically a fit rep, and everybody gets one from whoever their boss is. And I don't know the exact way the system works, but obviously it's an excellent way in a very low risk environment to practice writing effective fitness reports and evaluations. But unfortunately, it's just somewhat anecdotal, I guess, but from what I've seen, nobody wants to have that hard conversation. Nobody wants to write something that isn't great on everybody, because then people will think I'm a jerk. So unfortunately, I think this culture will continue on. And really what I think it boils down to, Dave, is that you have commanders who sign fitness reports who don't want to look someone in the eye and say, you're not going to get promoted. And that's your job as a commander. I can give you an anecdote on that. I think another time where I had a little bit of moral courage, we were ranking we had 505s that had to be ranked for 06. And there were a guy that was going to retire. There was a guy who was up for 06. And then there were 3 kind of relatively young 05s. And so we had what, I don't know if Marines do, we call it a murder board, where we got their bosses in there and we talked about everybody. And so we were, kind of racking and stacking and I knew all of them, but I mean, I'm a flag. I'm not in their workspaces that much. Anyway, the 2 young 05s we had were really, really good. And we had limits on how many we could rank at the top. And when it came time to this one individual, his boss said, who was some of them were civilians in there, but this guy was a Navy captain. And he said, well, he started with, hey, he's up for 06 this year. And he's been at the lowest one, and then he's been at the middle one, and he's got to show that progression to the right. He's got to get the highest on this one because he's going up for 06. And I said, is he ready to be in 06? And he said, with time. And I said, if we give him the highest right now, he's going to make 06, and you're saying he's not ready to be in 06. Is that correct? And he said, yes, sir. And I said, then we can't give that to him. And so we didn't. And I would say I've done a lot of fit rep and eval debriefs, but when you have, and this guy was prior enlisted, when you have somebody in your office that's your age crying because of something that you did, as he put it, that was very, very difficult. Ironically, maybe not ironically, but interestingly enough, this individual never did make '06, and very recently was put into somewhat high visibility position, was put into an '06 position temporarily and didn't last 2 weeks. So I guess I was in a sense validated on that decision, but in a way I feel bad that he had to go through that, because I was just one person, and under any other CO he would have made '06. Would the Navy have been better for it? No. Would he have been better for it? Yes. And did it really, I guess what I'm saying is, did it really matter that for this one particular situation I kind of held the line, and had someone, retire as an '05 that should have retired as an '05 instead of an '06, where everybody said, how the heck did this guy make '06?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people that I've asked that same question. How did that person become that rank? I've heard a lot of people ask the same question. I think it's pretty prevalent. Generally, it has very little to do with what somebody's personal opinion of that person is, and more of an opinion, the opinion of the whole applied to that person. It's interesting. I'm wondering, and I should know the answer to this question for myself, if the Marines still do this. I'm wondering if the Naval Academy midshipmen do this. But in my day, and again, this may still be going on, at officer candidate school and the basic school, we did peer evaluations. Just, there were 12 people, 14 people in your squad, whatever it was, rank everybody, put everybody's name 1 through 14. The card got turned into the leadership. Peer evals, we called them spear evals, because basically you were spearing somebody in the back. And it was a tool that obviously the leadership used, maybe still using, to figure out who are the problems based on the public perception of everybody else. Your classic 360-degree review. So my question is, one, does the Naval Academy do anything like that? And then my question to you, but it's really more to just everybody, is if those evaluations are so valuable to people running officer candidate school and then people running the basic school, why do we stop doing them when people go to the fleet, and ostensibly that's the most important time to be evaluating somebody's leadership? Why do we get away from a tool that's effective in one environment and not apply it to all the other environments?
No, you're spot on. And so I don't think they do that here. I've not heard that. I know they do it at Leatherneck, which is the kind of the mini TBS that the rising seniors go to if they want to select Marine Corps for their service assignment.
Mm-hmm.
But you're absolutely right. Anybody in the organization knows how everybody else in the organization is doing. And unfortunately, what I saw in the Navy is that the people that were ranked high sometimes were the ones that played the game better than the other people. Because I think some people have enough, I don't know what you'd call it, EQ, social awareness, what have you, to really, some people call it being political, but just understand how the game's played. And I think other people really don't know how the game's played. And it's very difficult. I don't know about the Marine Corps. I assume same thing. It's very difficult to be successful in the Navy unless you kind of get how the game's played. It doesn't matter how good you are, because that, we're and again, we've had, combat stuff, but I'm talking specifically in the supply corps. We're in a peacetime scenario. So if this person does well, it's because they know how to play the game better than the guy who doesn't. And a lot of times it's how well you're known. That's where the networking piece comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows this person? I was always surprised sitting on selection boards when I would see somebody really good that I hadn't heard of. And it was almost a bit of a down check. How could this person be so good if I don't know them?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think the 360 review is. I think the answer is it's just too painful, and I think your monkey in the tree people get called out on that big time.
Yeah.
And if we are looking to promote a certain type of person, we don't want to give a test that person will fail. We want to give a test that they will ace. And I think that's what keeping the 360. And here's the other thing too. Who are the leaders? This is all a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The leaders are, hey, so tell me about the fit rep system. Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, look at Pick Me. It picked
Right.
me, so of course it's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Any
I
system
am where I am.
that I
Right.
succeeded in is fantastic.
Yeah. I would even offer to young leaders who are listening to this episode that it doesn't have to be anything official. You could just do one in your platoon or in your department on a ship or anything. Just hand out a bunch of index cards and say, rank everybody in this department, top to bottom, and don't put your name on it. And at the bottom, put a number at the very bottom from 0 to 10, how well I'm doing. There you go. And then get all the index cards. And
as a leader, how well you're doing, or
yeah, I would ask my men and women, like, how well do you think I'm doing in this job? Just see what you get. Do you get 8s, 5s? I mean, a 5 is a 0. I mean, in the scale of things, nobody wants to be a 5. But maybe you just, I don't know. I had not thought that through at all when it came flying out of my mouth. I'm just saying that nothing has to be official. You can just do it.
Well, yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm done.
No, but you're spot on, because I'm doing that in my class, and I stole it from another teacher here, a real teacher, a PhD, not a you introduced me as professor or something. I mean, I'm an adjunct, so that's just basically a temp. But what I do halfway through the semester, and I do it at the midterm, is I hand everybody out a index card. And I tell them, okay, before you, and it's all online, obviously. So after you submit your midterm, write on one side of the card, what's going really great in our class. And on the other side, what can we do? What could we do better in our class? As I want it's our class. It's a we situation. And what I do then is I read them, and then the next week, say, hey, here were some kind of common themes. So here's some things that, here's something we're going to change. This thing specifically that 2 or 3 people mentioned, I can't change that. That's course policy. But it's kind of a great checkup from the neck up for me of, hey, how are things going? What's the vibe in the class, et cetera. And I also do that in coaching football with exit interviews, where you meet with the kids individually and you say, hey, you had a good season and you're coming back as a junior, and this is what we need, whatever. And I always end every one of those with, how could I be a better coach?
Yeah. That's a great question to ask.
And because they're the customer, right? Someone could say, you know what, I've just been watching you. You're a fantastic husband. And I would say, okay, well, thank you. But there's really only one person that can answer that question. That's my wife. Now, don't ask her today, because that might be a great answer to that. But typically speaking, I think I do pretty well in that department. But if as a leader, the people that you're leading, that's your customer. I'm a supply officer, so I think, who's my customer in this situation? It's the people we lead. So yeah, I want to get feedback. General Mattis, in his book Call Sign Chaos, which I'm sure you've read,
Mm-hmm.
is talked about walking, kind of the whole leadership by walking around. And there was a really, and this kind of dovetails kind of a little bit into what we were just talking about, but he talked about going around and asking his Marines how they were doing. And, the first time you do it, they'll say, oh, great, sir, fantastic. And then a leader will sometimes say, okay, well, they said to walk around and ask my guys how they're doing. And I asked everybody, and everybody's doing great. Guess I did my job. Um, it's that next time, and then it's that next time, and then it's that next time. And then you're going to start to get some feedback. Hey, sir, when we went out in the field the other day, yeah, I thought if we did, so you're not going to get that on, you can get feedback kind of two ways, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You can get it kind of in that anonymous fashion, or if you're talking to your people enough that they're comfortable with you, um, they'll give you some hints and things that we can do better. Now, the challenge is when you get something that is personal or something you don't want to change, because feedback is great, but you got to listen to it or it isn't effective. And if you don't listen to the feedback and you don't change it for whatever reason, or you pay lip service to it and you don't change it, you've lost them, and they'll never trust you again. And you're never going to get honest feedback, because back to kind of people getting relief for lack of confidence. I guarantee you, if you went to the people that work for whoever gets relieved for that reason and said, hey, were you surprised that this happened? Not at all. Not at all. Wondered why it took so long.
Right.
The people that work there, they know exactly what's happening.
They do. I know, everybody knows. If
you just got to get the information from them.
Right. And so I guess that's kind of my point, is that there are creative ways to get the information from people. It doesn't have to be an official system. It doesn't have to be a Marine Corps fitness report or, your qualification, your evaluation, your OER, whatever they're called across the different services. Every service has their own, and they're probably equally as flawed in different ways, or maybe the same. But there's other ways of getting information as a leader to find out who's doing well, who's not doing well, who's the monkey in the tree. Those things are very valuable pieces of information, because going back to what we really early on talked about, which is leadership isn't about the 90% of the people who are thriving in your command. It's about the 10% of the people who are not, and focusing your time and effort on making them better. And your measure of success is how well do you take those 10% and move them into the 90%, or, you know what I mean? You don't really move them in there, but you know what I mean? So how do you make your 90% go to 95% is really what I'm trying to say. And now I'm really curious, because you've had so much observation time with midshipmen, and you've had a career where you became a flag officer and saw it all, active duty and reserve. I'd like to ask the question in the context of your observation of midshipmen, although please feel free to answer it if you want to, part over some other portion of your career. But you've watched thousands of leaders come up through the ranks at the Naval Academy. What are some of the key turning points that tend to separate those who thrive from those who struggle? And then when you're done answering that question, I'm going to come right back and ask the same question about a different subset of people.
I guess I'll answer it two ways. One is we talked about kind of playing the game a little bit. And I think in any time you get into an organization, there's a way to play the game. And there are midshipmen who, based on where they went to school or their upbringing or whatever, seem to have more affinity and ability to play the game and understand the game. I guess rather play the game, understand the game better than others. And so the kids that struggle and most ultimately succeed, their big learning curve is, hey, how do I balance everything? How do I study properly? How do I get extra help? How do I balance all the different things that I'm doing? And that is a critical skill. Time management, prioritization, alligator closest to the boat, all of that different stuff. So that is, if you look at all the different things, that skill set and that ability to be just be the best midshipman you can be is a determining factor in success. And then the subset of that is the group, anywhere from 30 to 35 kids that I mentor on a semester basis, either weekly, biweekly, or monthly. So I hear a lot, I talk a lot, and I know a lot about them. And the DEI people would love this group that I mentor because it is as diverse a group as you could possibly get, with the different sexes, different prior service, gender, sexual orientation. I mean, everything. It is a completely heterogeneous mix of midshipmen. But there's one determining factor that determines whether or not they're going to be not ultimately successful, because usually they are all ultimately successful, but have success initially, or is it a struggle to get there towards the end? Their home life. Do they come from a supportive, loving two-parent family? And if they have that, I don't care, throw in every other, the most minority of minorities, doesn't matter. Because if they have that loving, supportive two-parent family that they come from, and and I'm not saying if you don't have that, you can't be successful, but the ones that have that, it's almost like they come in with a shield. And when the things start hitting them, they're so much better equipped to deal with the slings and arrows that the academy throws at them. And when I think about, and I did talk to one of the former commandants, a couple commandants ago, about this, and he agreed with me. A lot of times when you're watching the Army Navy game, I don't know when this will come out, but if you're watching the Army Navy game and here come the midshipmen, man, look at all them clean cut, Americans, blah, blah, blah. Some of these kids come from horrendous backgrounds, absolutely terrible backgrounds. And we just assume, well, look how great these kids look. They must all come from wonderful families, and they don't. And it was kind of back to that conversation we had at the very beginning of, hey, we can't assume that everybody one of the things we talk about in my class is cultural narrative, right? How do you view the world? What's been your background? We don't all come from the same cultural narrative. I'll tell you a quick story about one of my students. So he was in my second semester I taught here. So he was spring of 21. He had an honor issue. He had conduct issue. And he met with me about 4 weeks in the semester. He said, "Hey, sir, can I do extra instruction with you? Can I do EI?" And he had an A at that point. Now he ended up with a C, but he had an A at that point. And I usually don't get A students wanting extra instruction. I said, "Sure, come on over." So he sat down with me, and he said, "I get it now." And I said, "What do you get? Get what? What do you get?" He goes, "I get the whole honor concept." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, and he starts to tell me about his background, and he was mom was a drug abuser, raised by his dad. His dad didn't have a lot of money. He said, I would come home from school and the electricity would be off. We'd have no water. I'd have to, we're often moving. He said, I ran on the streets. And he said, where I came from, right was what you got away with and wrong's when you got caught. That was how I was raised.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, there was a guy in his high school who got him on a path to where he applied to the Naval Academy, went to the prep school, didn't do well there, and they decided to send him here. And we started meeting, and he kind of pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and through a ton of hard work, ended up being a company commander his second semester of his senior year. Huh. He's a Marine Corps officer now, logistics station. I think he's at Camp Pendleton. Yeah, he's at Camp Pendleton and doing fantastic. And it's such a classic example of, we can't judge you can't, as a leader, you can't just look at someone and say, oh, well, they look like they've got it together. A lot of these kids don't have it together. And our job as leaders is to find it, to know enough about them to like we talked about, helping the ones that are struggling, but understanding that our cultural narrative is going to be potentially way different theirs. My dad struggled with that his whole life. I don't understand why this person would react this way to this. Well, Dad, here's why. They didn't go to the Naval Academy. They weren't a Marine artillery officer, and they weren't an FBI agent. So yeah, they're not going to react the way you're going to react to something.
Right, right.
And as a leader, understanding that cultural narrative of our people is really, really important. So I kind of segued into that to throw a little of my class stuff in there. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. That's what makes guests and these episodes so popular. I'm gonna ask the same question too, because I'm gonna say, all right, so the Naval Academy is working towards creating these great leaders, and that is probably coming from guidance, example setting, things like that from the instructor staff. I don't know what you call them, cadre, but there are men and women, officers in uniform, teaching there at the academy and helping guide these young midshipmen to becoming America's future leaders. However, there have been instances, and most recently one, but there have been instances in the past where some of those leaders have not held themselves to an appropriate standard, and they themselves have found themselves in trouble and relieved, and maybe even court-martialed. I don't know. There's been some. I can't rattle them all off the top of my head, but I know there has been some issues there. I remember specifically a Marine major who something happened with a female midshipman, and I don't remember the whole deal there, but that's a Marine major. So now you've got instructors there who still struggle with ethical issues, with leadership issues, integrity. You can throw all the words at it. And so is there a common thread there that you've observed that have caused those sort of leadership failures with people who are ostensibly very experienced already, field grade officers, who still fall? And I'm just wondering if there's a common thread there, or...
Well, I don't know if there's a common thread. I guess what I've observed, and this is a really, specifically the Naval Academy is a very unique place.
Mm-hmm.
It's a military institution. Everybody's got CAC cards, everyone has ranks, but it's a college. The kids live in in Bancroft Hall, which is a dormitory, and they're 18 to 22-year-olds. So they like to do the things that 18 to 22-year-olds like to do, that we did, or at least
right.
I did. I won't speak for you, Dave. But,
well, I know what the ROTC kids are doing, so,
So and the other thing is the midshipmen here, and part of the reason that I love coming in here every day is these kids are just phenomenal kids.
Yeah.
Whether they're doing great or they're struggling, they still kind of are the best of the best, and they're great kids. They're fun to talk to. They're smart. It's just I every day it's when I talk to these kids and mentor them, and just it's really a lot of fun. Now I'm in the same situation, a little bit different. I'm not on active duty anymore, and I'm not as, none of my youngest is 32, and so these aren't even young, these kids are 10 years younger than my youngest. So I don't even view them as my kids per se. But in answer to your question, because of this unique environment, I think the people that, and there's been other things that have happened here of a similar nature that have got, I wouldn't say they've been swept under the rug, but they've been dealt with less publicly, shall we say that.
Mm-hmm.
Dealt with very quietly, which is totally fine. Fine. It's the common thread is you're an officer and they're not. And they're not your friend Lee, but they're not your friends. And I think as an ensign, that was way easier to do with an E2 than it is potentially with a lieutenant that works at the Naval Academy who's maybe graduated 4 or 5 years ago, and these kids are basically their peers. And I think, and even though you're a lieutenant, they're a midshipman, there's that line. That's where I think the gray area gets into, and then it's a college, and there's downtown Annapolis is a thriving, you know, uh, you know, bar scene and all that good stuff. So it's remembering, it's remembering what your job is. It's remembering that you're an officer and they're junior, the most junior of the junior officers. But really, if someone's listening to this, you know, if you're a lieutenant or a captain, you should be going out with lieutenants and captains, not their class midshipmen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, as we come up on the time here, I'm just wondering, were there any questions that I didn't ask you? Was there anything that I didn't touch on that you thought would be an important point to make about leadership?
One of the things that I have always, I love to study leadership and talk about it and observe it. And you're right with the the people that get relieved. What did they do wrong? What could I have done differently? But one of the things that I think that I love about leadership is that it's so personal. And I think people make mistakes when they feel that they can't be a successful leader because, oh, I'm not like Dave Armstrong. Boy, I'd love to be a great leader like Dave Armstrong, but I can't because he's that and I'm this. That's that's not accurate. The great thing about leadership is you can be any type of leader that you want to be. And I've seen you, and I know you've seen them as well. I've seen people that are just a do by example leader. I've seen yellers and screamers. I've seen, let's take that hill, follow me. I mean, you can be any type of leader that you can be. And if you are continually assessing how you do, and hey, is this the type of leader I want to be? Am I having effect? Am I doing what I talked about? You said, you mentioned earlier about thinking back, oh, hey, could I have done this differently? That's all part of leadership, but ultimately it's you get to be the type of leader you want to be, and no one's going to tell you how to be a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And being a bit of a rogue at times, I love that. I don't want someone to tell me, hey, you have to lead like this. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. I tend to be a little bit irreverent. I've always been that way. I'm that way in my class. And I had someone when I made flag, I had someone pull me aside and said, hey, can I give you a little bit of advice? Well, sure. Hey, this whole McNeal thing you got going, this whole irreverent, kind of joking around, that whole McNeal brand thing you got. You can't do that anymore. This was another flag, by the way. Yeah, you can't do that anymore. You're going to be an admiral. That's not how admirals act. And I said, sir, she was a woman, said, ma'am, thank you for that. But that is me, and that's how I'm going to be. So that's how Admiral McNeal is going to be. And that's how I am. And I think part of being a successful leader is being what I call ruthlessly consistent. You've got to be consistent in the things that you do, but also I've heard people say, well, as a husband, I'm this type of leader. And as a dad, I'm this type of leader. And as a church leader, I'm this type of leader. And as an officer, I'm this. No, if you got my wife, my kids, kids who have played for me, people who have worked for me in the civilian world, people who work for me in the military, students, and you put them in a room and you got a whiteboard out and hand them all markers and they started putting traits and things, they're going to talk about the same person. And if you're not authentic like that and genuine, being the type of person that you are all the time to everybody, I would argue, you're not going to be effective because it's hard enough being one person rather than 4 or 5
Mm-hmm.
or 2. So find out, and for the junior leaders here, they're listening. I should be able to ask you what type of leader you are if I ran across you in the street. Focus on being the best leader that you can be. Constantly be assessing, hey, this didn't go as well as I would have liked. How can I do this better? Hey, I gave this speech to the division and went over like a, what in church. Hey, E5, so and so. Hey, how come this thing didn't land like I thought it would? Constantly get feedback, and also realize, and again, it's trite and it's, but it's true. I mean, leadership is a journey, not a destination. And I learned something almost every day about leadership on how, and I try to true it up. It's like, don't you guys, when you do artillery, you're too far over the target, then you go shorter, then you go a little bit too far, and you're trying to true it up, right? Right. So you actually hit the target finally. Well, that's what I'm trying to do with leadership, and I don't think I'll ever get there. But I'm a lot closer to the mark now than I was as an ensign.
I'm 58 years old. I'm still on my leadership journey. Yeah. I mean, I learn something new every single day. I learn something new every single conversation I have, and something that's been rattling around in my head. And I need to refine this thought a little bit more. But here's the raw thought. When I told you, like I asked, you could ask people to score you on a scale of 1 to 10. And since I said that, and listening to you, I've been kind of thinking the consistency of leadership. I think if I was going to go back in my career, if I did something poorly, if there's one thing I'm disappointed in about myself as a leader, it was my lack of consistency. And when I say that, you think about the Christmas tree, and where do you fall out in the Christmas tree? There were days, weeks, months, half years, or even years where I was 1 out of X. I was the best. And then there were times where I was the worst. And, now looking back on my life in the military, I think to myself, I could have done such a better job in that role if I had realized XYZ, or I wasn't taking it so personally that I didn't like my boss or whatever. And so my lack of consistency is something I regret. I wish that because I was capable of being the best lieutenant, the best captain anywhere I was, I chose sometimes not to be the best. I kind of regret that. If I could do it all over again, I would have been more consistent. Great concluding point there. It was great conversation about leadership. This has been such a great time spent with you. I'm glad we connected, and I'm glad we got a chance to do this episode, because your insight and your experience there, not only in your career, all the way up to becoming a flag officer, but now your role at the Naval Academy. It's just been really awesome spending this time with you. And thanks so much for sharing your moments in leadership with the listeners. And I really appreciate your time.
Well, I think we've been recording for a while, but I'm hoping through the editing process, there'll be a few minutes that you can use.
At least 15.
No, I was just thinking as we were kind of talking, this has been, I've been on other podcasts. I mean, there's a reason. What are you, the second best or second ranked military leadership podcast? And I've been on other podcasts, and no offense to them, obviously. But your the way questions you ask and your style and everything. I mean, this time flew by, and I'll tell you, this went a totally different direction that I thought it would go in many areas. And there's stories that I told on this that I've never said, even to the mids that I mentor. So this is for the 7 fans I have out there. They're going to hear some new stories.
That's great. Exactly right. Turns out I'm finding out I'm a better question asker than I am a leader, but here's where we are, but I love it. So it's great. But I know what you mean. You have podcast blackout. You don't remember what you said, but I can tell you, having done over 50 of these now, that this was a fantastic episode, and it will be very well received, and your students will love it, and your colleagues will love it, and your friends from the fleet will love it as well. So thanks again for spending so much time with me.
You bet. Happy to be on.